In the thunder before dawn, when the ground itself trembled and soldiers swore they could hear death galloping before they saw it, iron-clad riders with towering feathers burst from the fog like a living storm, and in that instant, armies that outnumbered them 3-1 felt their courage collapse. Because this was not just another cavalry charge, this was the moment history later whispered about in fear and awe, the rise of the Winged Hussars, whose legend would echo across continents and centuries. And what makes their story so gripping is not only how they fought, but how they turned psychology into a weapon sharper than any blade. Imagine standing on a battlefield in the 1600s with muskets shaking in your hands, and suddenly the horizon fills with armored horses moving in perfect formation, sunlight catching polished steel, enormous wooden frames strapped to their backs covered in eagle feathers that roared in the wind like the wings of some mythical beast. And before a single sword struck flesh, half the enemy lines were already breaking because terror had already done its work. This was warfare transformed into spectacle and strategy fused with theater. And here is the hook that most people miss. They were not just fearless warriors, but disciplined professionals trained from youth in horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, and endurance so brutal it would break ordinary men in weeks. Their saddles were designed for speed and stability. Their lances could be over 18 feet long, giving them reach that infantry simply could not counter. And their armor balanced protection with mobility, allowing them to charge at astonishing speed without becoming slow metal statues. Yet what truly defined them was unity, because a single rider was dangerous, but a synchronized line of them was unstoppable. And battles that should have been lost on paper were flipped in moments because when they charged, they did not hesitate. They committed fully, knowing that momentum was their greatest ally. Another overlooked hook is the psychological engineering behind those wings, because historians still debate their exact purpose, but whether it was to create terrifying sound, to deflect lassos, or simply to dominate the visual field, the result was undeniable. Enemies wrote accounts describing panic before impact, horses refusing to stand their ground, commanders losing control as formations crumbled. And this was long before modern propaganda or cinematic warfare. This was raw human perception, manipulated with wood, feathers, and fearless execution. And if you follow their campaigns, you start to see a pattern where smaller forces defeated larger empires, not through miracles, but preparation, terrain awareness, and relentless training. They studied opponents, exploited weaknesses, and struck with timing that felt supernatural. And here comes another hook hidden in plain sight. Their success was not endless because no force in history remains invincible. The evolution of firearms, shifting politics, and economic strain slowly reduced their dominance, proving that even the most iconic warriors must adapt or fade. Yet their decline does not diminish their brilliance, because for over a century they redefined what cavalry could achieve and left such a deep imprint that centuries later military historians in places as far as the United States still analyze their tactics as early examples of shock warfare and morale disruption. And what keeps their legacy alive is not just the battles they won, but the image they created. The fusion of myth and metal that made them feel larger than life. They remind us that warfare is not only about weapons, but perception, discipline, and unity. And if you zoom out, you realize their story mirrors a universal truth about power itself. It rises through innovation and courage, peaks through mastery and confidence, and declines when adaptation slows. Yet the echo of greatness never fully disappears, because inspiration travels further than armies ever can. So when people today watch recreations or read accounts, they are not just learning history, they are witnessing how determination, strategy, and psychological dominance once combined to produce a force so striking that even centuries later, the image of feathered riders charging across open fields still sends a chill down the spine. And that is the final hook.
The reason their legend survives is because they were not merely soldiers in armor, they were a reminder that the human mind can be as decisive as any weapon, and that sometimes the loudest victory begins long before the first clash of steel.
And just when rival kingdoms believed they had finally understood the secret behind those thunderous charges and thought numbers or gunpowder alone could stop them, another wave of brilliance emerged, because the true strength of the Winged Hussars was never only in their equipment, but in their adaptability. Their commanders studied terrain like chess masters reading a board, choosing open plains where their speed became lethal and avoiding cramped ground where cavalry would suffocate. And this awareness turned geography itself into an ally. There's a gripping hook hidden here, because many battles were decided before the first horse even moved. Plans were drawn with such precision that when the charge finally happened, it felt inevitable rather than risky. And soldiers described it as watching a storm you could see forming, yet were powerless to escape. Their horses were not ordinary mounts either, but carefully bred war animals trained to remain calm amid explosions, screams, and flashing steel, conditioned to trust the rider completely so that fear never broke formation. And this bond between human and animal created a level of synchronization that opponents rarely matched. Another powerful hook is how discipline replaced chaos, because while other forces relied on brute courage, the Hussars drilled endlessly, repeating maneuvers until muscle memory erased hesitation. And when hesitation disappears, speed becomes ruthless. You begin to understand why entire armies hesitated at the mere rumor of their arrival. Yet history never flows in a straight victorious line, and the same innovation that once gave them supremacy slowly shifted against them. Firearms improved, fortifications strengthened, and battlefields transformed into tighter, more defensive arenas where long lances lost their advantage. But instead of vanishing overnight, their influence evolved. Tactics they pioneered filtered into modern military doctrines studied far beyond Europe, including institutions and analysts in the United States who examined shock tactics, morale impact, and rapid mobility as early blueprints for mechanized warfare centuries later. And here's the hook that turns admiration into reflection. Their story is not simply about triumph, but about the relentless demand for reinvention, because even legends must adapt or be rewritten by time. The imagery of wings and steel became symbolic rather than practical, a reminder that morale and identity can be as powerful as strategy itself. And as their era closed, what remained was not silence, but legacy. Artists painted them as near-mythic figures, writers described their charges with poetic intensity, and reenactments kept the thunder alive for new generations who never heard the original roar, yet still felt its echo. The most fascinating hook is realizing that their greatest victory might not have been a single battlefield, but the way they mastered fear, both their own and their enemies, transforming courage into a contagious force that spread through ranks like fire through dry grass. And when you step back and view the entire arc, you see more than armored riders. You see a lesson carved into history, that innovation without discipline fades. Discipline without adaptation breaks, but when vision, preparation, and unity collide, they can create moments so powerful that centuries later, people still lean forward when the story begins, still picture the horizon darkening with approaching figures, still feel the vibration of hooves in their imagination. And that lingering sensation is the final continuation of their legend, because true impact is not measured only by victories recorded in books, but by the emotions that survive long after the battlefield dust has settled, proving that the Winged Hussars were not merely a military force, but a timeless demonstration of how human determination and psychological mastery can turn ordinary men into symbols that outlive empires. And as the years pushed forward and empires shifted like sand under restless winds, the legend of the Winged Hussars refused to fade quietly, because stories of their charges had already embedded themselves into military culture, whispered from veteran to recruit, painted onto banners and carved into collective memory as proof that courage multiplied by discipline could bend the course of history. Yet here comes another gripping hook that many overlook. Their endurance was not powered by glory alone, but by structure,
funding, logistics, and social hierarchy that supported elite warriors for generations. And when those pillars weakened, the once unstoppable force began to feel the weight of reality. Armor that once symbolized invincibility slowly turned into a burden as firearms grew deadlier and battlefields shrank into tighter formations where speed had less room to breathe. But even during this gradual transformation, their presence still commanded respect, because reputation itself became a weapon. Armies prepared differently when they knew hussars were near. Commanders overestimated their numbers, and fear once again fought on their behalf before steel ever met steel. Another hook hidden in this phase is how legacy shifts from physical dominance to symbolic power, because while their battlefield supremacy declined, their cultural influence expanded. Ballads, literature, and visual art immortalized them as larger-than-life figures, turning historical soldiers into near-mythical icons whose wings became metaphors for ambition, resilience, and national pride. And this symbolic rebirth ensured that even as tactics changed, their identity only grew stronger. Observers across continents, including analysts and historians in the United States, began studying not only their victories, but the psychology behind their methods, recognizing that shock value, unity of motion, and morale manipulation were early glimpses of principles later echoed in modern armored divisions and rapid assault doctrines.
And here is the hook that transforms admiration into understanding. Their story teaches that power is never static. It is a living force that demands evolution. Because the same innovation that creates dominance today can become tomorrow's limitation if growth stops. Yet decline does not erase greatness. It refines it into lesson and legend. And as reenactments, museums, and historical studies kept their memory alive, the thunder of hooves turned into the echo of inspiration, reminding each new generation that the image of feathered riders charging into overwhelming odds was not fantasy, but a testament to preparation meeting opportunity. And the final continuation of their saga reveals something deeply human. The reason their story still captivates minds is not merely the spectacle of wings and steel, but the universal truth it carries, that fear can be engineered, unity can amplify strength beyond numbers, and identity can outlive mortality. So when the dust of centuries settles and the battlefield becomes quiet fields of grass, the legend does not disappear. It transforms into a mirror reflecting ambition, discipline, and the unending drive to rise above limitation, proving that while empires crumble and technologies evolve, the impact of a force that mastered both mind and momentum can continue to charge through history long after the last real horse has stopped running. And in the final stretch of their saga, when the noise of cannons grew louder than the thunder of hooves, and the world slowly stepped into an age where steel wings could no longer dominate open fields, the Winged Hussars did not vanish in a single defeat, but dissolved into history like a sunset that refuses to disappear all at once. Their armor retired piece by piece, their lances shortened, their formations absorbed into newer military systems. Yet the essence of what they represented refused to die, because the true ending of their story was never written on a battlefield, but inside the minds of those who witnessed or later studied them. And here lies the last hook that ties everything together. Their greatest victory was not territory or treasure, but the permanent mark they carved into the psychology of warfare, proving that fear could be orchestrated, unity could multiply strength beyond numbers, and preparation could make ordinary humans appear legendary. Even as modern armies replaced horses with engines and feathers with metal machines, the principles they embodied quietly lived on in strategies taught across the world, including military thinkers in the United States who examined how morale, speed, and shock could decide outcomes before raw firepower ever spoke. And when you step back to view the full arc, from their explosive rise to their graceful fading, you realize their ending was not a collapse, but a transformation from physical force into enduring symbol.
Paintings preserved their image, reenactments revived their thunder, books retold their charges, and generations who never heard the real roar of wings still felt its vibration through stories. And that is the true closure of their history, because legends do not end, they transition. They move from dust and steel into memory and meaning, leaving behind a reminder that dominance built on courage and discipline can shake the world, but legacy built on inspiration can outlive centuries. So the final image is not of a fallen rider or a
By the
broken
16th
lance,
century,
but
the
of a
Commonwealth had
horizon
become one of
once
the
filled
largest
with
states in
fearless
Europe,
silhouettes,
entering a
now
period
living
historians
forever
now
in
call the
imagination,
Golden Age.
proving that while time erases footprints, it cannot silence the echo of those who once charged so fiercely that even history itself had to make room for their wings.